Everybody, if you could take your seats, we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Dave Turk. I'm the head of the Energy Environment Division at the International Energy Agency, and welcome to a side event hosted by ClimateWorks and the IEA. I'm going to be moderating this session today. We're going to go through a very distinguished panel for some opening remarks, and then we hope to get into questions as quickly as we can. So start thinking of good, insightful, intriguing, compelling questions as we go through the various presentations today. I also like to welcome those who are watching us on the web, on live stream as well. So as you in the audience think of your questions, recognize that you will be on the web, you will be live streamed, so keep that in mind as well. Today's topic is an incredibly important one. It's on early action. How to motivate it, how we can track today's actions on future emission levels. A little over a year ago, just before the Paris COP, IEA produced a report spelling out some of the thoughts from our perspective, looking into day in and day out the energy trends and what's going on in the energy sector. Sector, of course, that's responsible for 2/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions. We said a number of things to look out for in the Paris Agreement that we were hoping were going to be in the Paris Agreement. One is a strong long-term goal, right? Something that can help guide countries, something that can help guide companies, others who work in the real world, sending a political signal out there, a North Star, if you will, to guide any and all efforts. Second part was some kind of iterative, 5-year iterative cycle, something that could allow countries, could allow others an opportunity to increase their ambition over time, understanding that the original batch of intended nationally determined contributions, now NDCs, wasn't going to achieve certainly the 2-degree trajectory that was set out. We also said it was essential that emissions peak soon, so our chances of achieving that 2-degree pathway or a well below 2-degree pathway don't slip away, that it doesn't become more and more expensive the longer we wait for actions, and to find motivations that will really resonate with countries, with companies, with others in the real world. What really makes countries enact policies? What are the various factors that play on them, including political imperatives in their particular context? What motivates companies and investors to actually invest and to decide to go with one project or another, and to think about those various policies and incentives that really work to motivate real-world actors, and that's one of the key topics for today. Another thing we said was it's critical to track the underlying transition of the energy sector, not just tracking the emissions, but actually tracking the sector and how the renewables piece fits with the efficiency piece, with the integration piece, and the variety of different parts that need to come together for this energy transition. So with those framing remarks, I'll introduce each panelist in turn, and then that panelist will have a chance to offer some opening remarks, and then we'll open it up, as I said, for questions. I'm going to start to my left up here with Christina Hood. She's a treasured colleague at the IEA. She's now heading the Environment and Climate Change Unit, bringing over policy implementation at the international, national, and also at the local government levels. Her team manages IEA's interface with the UNFCCC negotiation, and she really focuses a lot of her attention, and including in the years ahead, on this kind of real-world low-carbon policy implementation in the energy sector. So with that, Christina, over to you.
Thanks, Dave. I heard a report from the previous side event that some people in the back were having trouble hearing with the mics. Can we get a thumbs up? Is it all right in the back of the room? Okay, good. I've pulled it quite close, so we'll try and remember to do that. So thank you for coming, everyone. In this first part of the talk, on the IEA side, we were going to talk about actions to really drive emissions reductions pre-2020. So just to introduce the IEA and its work, clearly meeting the long-term objectives of the Paris Agreement requires an acceleration of the clean energy transition. The IEA has a strong role in supporting this in several areas, and solutions and data and analysis is the way that we're describing it. So the real-world solutions needed to support successful policy implementation. So this is things like policy guidance and working directly with countries on developing policies and implementing them. The analysis is something that you may be more familiar with, things like our World Energy Outlook and our modeling efforts, and the data, the greenhouse gas statistics, but also data on indicators on demand side, on investment and so on, that can underpin this process. And we're really pleased to be able to support the process in all of these ways. In the Paris Agreement, we were really pleased to see reference to the aim to reach global peaking of GHG emissions as soon as possible, because in our analysis, this is essential if that below 2 degrees goal is to remain within reach. Right before Paris, we published an analysis of how we could do this, how we can raise climate ambitions. So there were 5 key measures, which we call the bridge scenarios, starting with energy efficiency, reducing use of inefficient coal, renewables investment, upstream methane reductions, and fossil fuel subsidy reform. Now, together, these 5 areas of action we found could reduce almost 5 gigatons of emissions by 2030. And more importantly, achieve a peak in emissions around 2020, with 2 important, not caveats, but 2 important bonuses. One is that it uses only existing technologies, and the second is that this is GDP neutral. So we've done the modeling. This comes at 0 GDP cost to implement this package of measures. Looking at a couple of them individually, on energy efficiency, the sorts of things we're talking about are the things that we're doing in our Energy Efficiency and Emerging Economies program, working with countries to develop building codes, develop strategies for the challenges that they see for themselves. On renewable energy, this is a piece of analysis which just came out a couple of weeks ago in our medium-term renewable energy market report, where we see renewables as the fastest growing source of electricity now. They've surpassed coal to become the largest source of installed power capacity, but still not quite where we need to be for a below 2 degrees pathway. So coming back to this bridge scenario, one thing that's important to note, I said it was GDP neutral, and it's not just GDP neutral globally, it's GDP neutral in every region that we model. And in order to achieve that, each region needs to put together the 5 pieces in a different way. So you can see that the relative shares of the different measures, be it energy efficiency or coal, renewables, are different in the different regions because of their different mitigation opportunities. But we can put it together so that it works for each region. In terms of the emissions, where does this get us? As I said, if we compare to where the INDCs are tracking in blue, we compare to a 50% 2 degrees scenario there in green, our 450 scenario. The bridge scenario is somewhere in between. It allows us to peak global emissions by around 2020, but then clearly more is needed after that. But without peaking global emissions, we can't get there. So this is clearly a really useful and important first step to take. But up until now, I've been talking about all of this in terms of things that can peak emissions. But when we head out into the real world with our energy sector hats on, we have to think about what actually motivates countries to take these sorts of actions. And the reality is that while the energy sector and actions in the energy sector are absolutely critical for achieving greenhouse gas targets, it doesn't necessarily work the other way around. A greenhouse gas target is not necessarily the most important driver for people who are taking energy sector actions. There are many other motivators that can be bigger factors in taking some of these clean energy actions. Saving money is a really big one for an energy efficiency. Many of the actions we're talking about are cost effective today, and it's a case of overcoming the barriers to being able to implement them. Air quality is a big concern, road congestion, energy security, all of these things can be what motivates policymakers much more, and the greenhouse gas reductions end up being the co-benefit. So I just wanted to speak briefly about just one of these, which is the air quality question. And this is a shot on a very bad day of my hometown of Paris. It's not somewhere in a developing country. It's not normally like that. The sky is normally blue in Paris, but we have our moments. To tackle these air quality concerns, the IEA this year did some analysis, which we released a couple of months ago, to look at how climate goals and air quality goals could be addressed in a way that is co-optimized. So we do things that don't, it's not just dealing with air quality, it's not just dealing with climate, how do we deal with them together? And we developed what we called the clean air strategy. So with the clean air strategy, there is a small incremental investment of 7% compared to the baseline strategy. And it results in a massive reduction in number of premature deaths due to air pollution. So over 3 million collectively. The reason it doesn't match up to the bar on the right is that because that's just the outdoor air pollution on that graph, and this is both indoor and outdoor pollution that we're talking about. And as well as having this really great benefit on human health and people's well-being, which would be the main reason that you would pursue a package like this, it also has the effect again of allowing greenhouse gas emissions to peak. So you can see that it's a very similar kind of a trajectory as in our bridge scenario, which is not a big surprise because many of the same measures are the ones that you would use. So, increased renewables, increased energy efficiency, as well as adding in measures to deal directly with the emissions. So the, end of pipeline pollution controls and so on. But you can put together a package, as I say, which deals with the air quality concerns and the climate concerns together, which allows us to peak emissions in the short term and then provides perhaps a stepping stone to take the next step and head more towards where we need to be on a well below 2 degrees trajectory. So in terms of taking that next step, I'm not going to go into that a lot in this event because this is an event on those pre-2020 actions, but clearly more is needed. We need improved technology costs and improved performance. IEA is strongly involved in a lot of technology collaboration work, including with the SEM Secretariat. We need to pay attention to whether today's investments are locking in emissions that are going to last for decades and how we're going to deal with infrastructure that is already locked in. We need to deal with policy packages that work in the real world. This is a real theme of our IEA policy work in the past couple of years and coming up. So if we aren't going to have the $100 a ton carbon prices that appear in the economic models, how do we still put together policy packages that get us to where we need to be? And then finally, we need to track where we're going, not just in terms of greenhouse gas levels, but in terms of underlying energy infrastructure, which is what we're going to hear more about from the ClimateWorks side. But I just wanted to show one example of that. At the IEA, we've started producing a new annual report on energy sector investment. So this is a leading indicator that tells us where the energy system is headed in the future, not just where it is today. And this is one of my favorite metrics. It's the, I guess you've got to be a bit of a climate nerd to have a favorite metric, but it's the carbon intensity of new power plants. So not the existing fleet. These are the new plants that are built each year. And you can see that it's been gradually improving, which is great. But then you can compare it to where you would need to be consistent with a 2 degrees. And that new investment needs to be much, much cleaner than today's plant in order to be able to shift the average values quickly enough. So thinking about these alternative kinds of metrics can shed some additional light on the challenges for today's actions that we need to take pre-2020. If you're interested in more IEA analysis, here are 3 new publications which are being launched across the time of COP. The first one is about real-world policy insights. It's energy, climate change and environment. Then there's a specialist publication on carbon capture and storage. And then finally, the World Energy Outlook for this year, which will be launched on the 16th in London, and there'll be a special presentation here at COP on the 17th. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Christina. We'll turn to our second panelist now, Dr. He's the Director of Strategy and Planning Department at the National Center for Climate Change Strategy and International Cooperation in China, has a PhD in Resource and Environment Economy. He's also served as a climate change negotiator of the Chinese government, negotiation coordinator and lead reviewer of the UNFCCC, a senior consultant of IEA, focusing for many years on energy and climate change policy, including low carbon strategy and planning, energy and climate modeling. So a whole wealth of expertise for us today. He's also led more than 30 national key projects and international cooperation projects, and involved in many of the key policymaking processes on climate change and low carbon development in China. So Dr. Liu Kuang, very much appreciate having you here with us today and looking forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to be here to have this talk about pre-2020 emission reduction policy in China. Actually, so I working in NCSC. We mainly work on energy and climate change policy, especially low carbon policies. So I think I will emphasize most 2020 before 2020, but also mention some research results we have done in last year. So before that, I will give some just a very brief introduction of the current key policies and targets in recent year in China. In 2009, we already have our government announced this carbon intensity target, reduce of carbon intensity per GDP by 40 to 45% from 2005 to 2020. This is a key target along this 15 years period, and even now I think that's still the key targets we need to follow in the next 5 years. And second one, that in 2012 we have the working plan for controlling of greenhouse gas emission controlling during 2010 to 2015, and in that policy document we announced that we will reduce carbon intensity in that 5 years 17% reduction. And that's mainly key document, policy documents for the 2010 to 2015. And already that's last year is finished. In 2014, we have climate change, national plan for climate change, not only mitigation, but also the climate change adaptation. Also reading the main targets for the periods until 2020. And the very important issue is last year that China released our NDC, which gave the midterm targets. Carbon emission targets means that we will achieve the carbon emission peaking around 2030, and also we will try our best to achieve that peak earlier. And also we need to reduce the carbon intensity by 60 to 65% from the 2005 to 2030. And also we will increase the non-fossil fuel targets to the 20% in total primary energy consumption. So these three targets, I think it's mainly targets that we will follow for next 15 years. And that would be very important for us to think about what we can do and what we need to do in next 5 years. So based on this condition, based on this situation, that this year, just I think it's 1 week before, we released this working plan for controlling greenhouse gas emission during the 13th 5-year plan. That means from 2015 to 2020. So this is the main policy document, I think, that for next 5 years, what we need to do for the greenhouse gas emission controlling. So in this policy document, very key targets we raised is 18% reduction of the carbon intensity from 2015 to 2020. So in the following page, maybe I just want to elaborate what kind of policy and targets in this policy document. And before that, I will just give very brief look at what we already done in China before the 2015 in last 5 years. First one, I think that it's very important for us to establish some organization or institution scheme for China to manage greenhouse gas issues. So we have national leading group on climate change. We have the national departments of climate change, but also I think we already have the 10 provinces to build their own climate change departments in local level. And second one, we have to think about the strengthening the regulatory system for low carbon development. Most apparent issues that we have this carbon intensity target. We allocate this target to the provincial level, and every year from the 2013, we will assess what kind of progress each province already achieved for this target. So I think that would be very, very, very strict targets, as every province policymaker have to make sure they can achieve this target. And third one is top level designing, especially I think that's very important is legislation. So we draft our climate change law in last 3 years and still in the progress of the legislation. But we also need to have another legal document to promote the carbon emission market for next year. And we have the plans and strategies. We have the low carbon development strategy research, which I think that in last 3 to 4 years, we totally organized 37 research projects under this program. And tomorrow morning, we will give this introduction of this program in China Pavilion. If you are interested, you can go to there to listen. And another policy and actions, I think, is mainly on the main areas. Main areas like economy structure adjustment, energy conservation, energy structure optimization, and also increase of carbon sink, and also other like missing and N2O emission controlling. I don't want to touch degree, but every areas we have a lot of research. And also another very important issue in last 5 years for China is to do the low carbon pilot and demonstration, especially from the different level. Like from provincial and city level, we have this type pilots. From the industry park level, we also have pilots. And also it's very important that we initiate 7 carbon emission trading pilots from the 2014. And next year, our plan is to initiate our national emission trading market. And the final one is in the last 5 years, very important issues as to enhance our MRV system and also the databases for the greenhouse gas emission controlling. So we already have the first and the second national inventory, and we are working on the third one. And every province already finished their provincial greenhouse gas emission inventory. This is what we have achieved in the last 5 years. We can find that the energy structure become much optimized from the last 10 years. So now the coal still take account of almost 2/3 of total energy consumption. But you need to know that that is because the energy consumption of China is quite huge, and it's not so easy for China to change to eliminate use of coal. But I think for the last 10 years, we already achieved lots to reduce the coal use in some areas and also controlling coal use in many key areas. And also for renewable energy, I think that now the share of renewable energy, non-fossil fuel energy, including nuclear and renewable, already achieved 12% in total energy consumption. Our national target is 11.4, so we already surpassed our target. So from the carbon intensity, actually, I think it's in last 5 years, we already reduced our carbon intensity almost more than 20%, which is also higher than the national target. So based on that, I think it's by 2020, we're hoping that our energy, carbon intensity can, the performance would be more than our targets. So what kind of policy and targets by 2020 in China? I think it's, we can find this mean targets, we can put this as a 3 perspective. One is the quantitative targets. That means reducing carbon emission per unit of GDP by 18% in next 5 years. Another is controlling the total carbon emission. I think this is a quite good signal for China, because that's previously we mainly focused on the intensity relative target. But in next 5 years, we will also at the same time consider its quantitative, it's absolute targets, means that we will also need to consider how to controlling the total carbon emission. From last year, the carbon emission in China already have a little bit decreased, but I think that may be just a short-term issue. So we hope that in the next 5 years, this total carbon emission can also achieve some maybe stable, a little bit growth, but I think that the total carbon emission amounts will be controlled in high degree. And also we need to enhance the controlling of the non-CO2 greenhouse gas emission, especially HFC and missing from the several areas. And second part is, I think it's what kind of actions we need to do to achieve the carbon emission peaking targets. So I think we will encourage early peaking of the key optimization development regions, which means mainly economy advanced region in east side of China. And second one, we will encourage early picking of some key energy intensive industries, especially like steel, cement, and also co-chemical industries. And third one, we will deepening the low carbon pilot and demonstration, especially we hope that what kind of effect, what kind of practical results we can get from this pilot, because that pilot already lasted for 5 years. So we hope that next 5 years we can get some more remarkable results. And also, it's another very important is controlling of the carbon emission and also air pollutants. Especially, I think it's the particle pollutants in key areas like Beijing, Tianjin, and Hebei regions. It's the governments have put a lot of efforts, put very strict targets on the air pollution controlling, and also that's one of very important measures to achieve that target is controlling the coal consumption in these areas. So that would have very good co-benefits of carbon emission reduction. And third part, I think is very important for China is to increase the capacity building of China to support the carbon emission controlling or carbon emission reduction, which I think first one is this national carbon emission trading market, which means that we will depend more on the market-based mechanism rather than just using the command and control measures. So that would be very important for China. It's very important issues from the climate change areas in the next 5 years, and we hope we can initiate that national market in next year, and we hope that in next 5 years we can gradually complete this market. One is we have to make sure that we need to increase the legal basis for climate change. Currently, we didn't have climate change law in China, so we will also fasten this process in next 5 years. And also, we need to completing our MRV system, which is quite important, especially from the data perspective. If there's no quality data for China, it's very difficult for us to have good policies and also good performance. And this is some low carbon and policy actions in key areas like promote energy transition, promote low carbon urbanization, building the low carbon industry system, promote regional low carbon development. I don't want to touch very detailed, but I will emphasize that for each key areas, we have very specific, we have very detailed targets. For example, for power generation, for energy from the energy transformation perspective, in power sector, we have that improve energy conservation, energy intensity by 15% from the total energy perspective. But also we have this target of keep the large-scale power generation plants, their emission intensity, carbon emission intensity should be lower, not higher than the 550 gram carbon dioxide per kilowatt hours. I think that is a new target for the power plants, and that is very good signal. It's quite maybe not so aggressive like United States carbon emission standard, but I think it's a big step for China to move forward. And also from the urbanization areas, it's very important for China to controlling the emission growth in this area, especially like building area and transportation areas. So we have specific targets in these areas. However, I think it's building and transportation, their emissions will still grow in next 5 years or even in next 15 years. But the most important thing is how to link low carbon development with urbanization, because urbanization might become the main driving forces for China in next 15 years. As previously we mainly it's driven by the industrialization process, but in next 15 years we'll change to the urbanization process. And another point I want to emphasize is this kind of regional balance, how to achieve regional balance and at the same time promote low carbon development. So we will give the different targets for different regions. Like some economy advanced regions, they need to achieve the peaking earlier than other regions. Like Western regions, they can get some lower emission peaking year, but at the same time, they have to make sure they will control their carbon emission very strictly. And also we will encourage some low carbon pilots and low carbon city to achieve peaking earlier. These are some pilots and demonstration by 2020. There are some different targets for different pilots, like a 15 pilot project, like 100 promise and pilots by 2020, and totally 80 pilots for low carbon industry park pilots, and 1,000 low carbon community pilots. And also that CCUS, we want to extend or deepen the demonstration. So this pilot, I think, will provide very good basis in whole country to give good example for different area people. And this is some roadmap for our national emission trading markets. I don't want to touch it away because I think there's a lot of side events in China Pavilion talking about national emission trading market. But most important thing for us is from next year, we will initiate this market, and then we will spend at least 5 years to complete this system, complete this scheme, and try to make sure that the 10 key sector, which is including this carbon emission trading scheme, can reduce their carbon emission within our limits. So I think it's by the end of this year, maybe the government will start allocate the quota for different companies in this 10 key areas. And this is some research we have done for the evaluation of the mean carbon emission policies. This is some like system analysis model we use. We work together with Energy Innovation of the United States. And the main result is here. I think first the result, the regulatory policy will play an important role in short and mid-term by 2030. But carbon pricing has far higher abatement potential compared with other policies. So that means that we try to internalize the carbon emission externalities into the activities, and also try to using the market-based carbon pricing mechanism to reduce carbon emission. And also third one is the efficiency policy as the primary driver of emission reduction, because that's last 15 years we already have done a lot in energy efficiency improvements. So next 5 years, we still need to keep an eye on this kind of policies. And finally, in my conclusion, I think that the first one is the development pattern transition is key for low carbon development. We call Chinese economy entering into some new status, it's new normal. That means we will focus more on the growth quality, not on the growth quantity. So I think that is very important for China to consider how to achieve this transition. Second one is the next 5 years key period to achieve the NDC targets, national determined contribution target, especially achieve the carbon emission peaking targets. And third one, I think is good policy environment is very key for driving the low carbon transition, especially from 2 points of view. One is that the legal status, how to enhance the legal status of carbon emission controlling. Another is how to use more market-based mechanism, including ETS, carbon emission trading system, but also like others, like carbon service company, like PPP, to increase the incentive for the carbon emission reduction. Okay, I will stop here, and if more questions, I'm glad to communicate with all of you in the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you to both of our first panelists for outlining some key actions in the pre-2020 space, actions, efforts, but also further opportunities as well. And hopefully we'll get back into some of this in particular. We're now going to shift just a little bit. We're going to focus now on tracking progress, and specifically with Dr. Surabhi Menon, who's going to introduce something called the Carbon Transparency Initiative, which is a very exciting effort out there. Dr. Menon is the Advisory and Research Director at ClimateWorks, who is co-sponsoring this particular side event with IEA. Her work supports climate philanthropy by providing a global context for climate mitigation and climate policy progress, identifying high-impact investment opportunities, supporting energy transitions that lead to low-carbon pathways, and working on frameworks to identify the development and economic benefits associated with reducing climate pollution. She's published over 60 peer-reviewed publications, including co-authoring the 2007 IPCC report that led to a Nobel Peace Prize. Dr. Menon is going to be auctioning her Nobel Peace Prize after this session to raise money for charity, so everybody be ready for that. I'm just kidding. She also has been a staff scientist and leader of the Heat Island Group at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory in California, and has also been a climate scientist at Columbia University and at NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies in New York. So with that, Dr. Menon, over to you.
Thank you, David. Good afternoon to all of you. continuing on the topic, I'll be talking about what does pre-2020 look like in terms of tracking decarbonization progress. As part of that, I'm delighted to talk to you about the Carbon Transparency Initiative. A few years ago, colleagues of mine at ClimateWorks Foundation and others were thinking about how do we know what the future looks like? What greenhouse gas pathways are many of the world economies going to be on? Were the indicators we could be tracking that could help tell us what the decarbonization trends could be early on without necessarily waiting for outcomes in 2020 or 2030. So the result is the Carbon Transparency Initiative, which is a project of the ClimateWorks Foundation. For those not as familiar with the ClimateWorks Foundation, we work with many of the other climate foundations in the climate space through a variety of offerings: programmatic sector work, grant making, funder collaboration, and also an advisory and research to help leverage our collective efforts towards fighting climate change. So we created the Carbon Transparency Initiative to help guide our programmatic sector work and also help our funders and other partners get reliable, consistent information that could be used to improve on our funding strategies in the philanthropy side and also track the progress of those strategies over time. This information is important because high-level efforts to just look at GHG emissions are not always as helpful unless you look at the specific drivers leading to those emission trends. By looking at over 130 specific indicators of the drivers that lead to trends in GHG emissions, we hopefully could answer questions that are fundamental to knowing if the world is on track to reducing its emissions. So the honeycomb that you see here, I don't know if you could read all of the indicators. It seems to be difficult, but basically these are the different kinds of indicators that we've been tracking to look at the trends in greenhouse gas emissions. A few of them include the coal share of total energy use for the power sector side. On the transport, we look at many indicators. One of them listed here is the share of rail freight in ton kilometers. All of these indicators are available through the ClimateWorks tracker. So we just launched this new website, which was released last week. A few of you here may have been at a public webinar that we did. This website is easy to use, which helps you look at current progress of greenhouse gas emissions at a glance, and where all of those different indicators that I mentioned are all displayed. It can be found at climateworkstracker.org. We also realized just having information and creating a website that is transparent and accessible to many of you is not enough. Information and partnership is really important if we want to drive action, mobilize action, and increase the ambition level, especially if we want to go beyond the 2020 targets. So the ClimateWorks tracker, I'm going to talk to you about the information that is available through the ClimateWorks tracker, the collaborations that we have, and the two gentlemen on both my sides are part of the collaboration that we have. Of the network that we have, and also how we're trying to go about through the action framework. So the tracker presents data from a current development scenario. So it's looking at current investment trends, current policies, and current decarbonization in order to project what GHG emission pathways we might be on in between 2015 up to 2030. So these are available for all of the countries that are shaded in green. The latest one, which we hope to be putting up early next year, is for Brazil, which the SEG group from Brazil has been helping us with, along with the ICS, the Institute for Climate and Society in Brazil. The data for the ClimateWorks tracker is available, is coming through peer-reviewed country models that we built for all of the countries that we just described. And that looks at greenhouse gas trends on an annual time step from 2010 through 2030. So it can be used to compare to inventories up to 2014 or 15. It's open source and available by request through the tracker site to anyone who would like to use it. It's there for about 11 sectors. Now the math on the picture tells you it's 6, but that's because the industry is divided into 4 subsectors: iron and steel, cement, chemicals, and a catch-all industry, which includes paper and pulp, beverages, food, etc. The models have been designed to be simplistic enough and consistent, and yet it's designed to be able to capture the unique characteristics that is relevant to a particular geography. The tracker then provides a way to compare all of these information in a way that can be easily used to compare how countries or sectors are doing in terms of their decarbonization progress. So these are available through the 3 dashboards, the regions, sectors, and the metrics dashboard, which has all of the information which hopefully you could use. And then there is one which just has all of the methodology, the documentation about the model and how we go about producing insights from the work that we do. So rather than website and showing you what it does, we just have snapshots right here. So what you see on your screen is the snapshot for China. It's available for all of the countries. You just click onto the particular country, and what you see is emissions for China across all of the sectors that we track. And you can see that a bulk of the emissions in China, as you saw a little bit of what Dr. Liu showed earlier, there's industry and power. However, if you want to be able to see when is China going to peak in its emission, is it peaking quicker than 2030? According to our model, it does peak earlier than 2030. It is capable of meeting its 2020 targets as well. So you could use the sector data to see how well China is doing. On the right-hand side, you could see the differences in the emissions. That's because we change our assumptions of GDP growth and population in order to see how countries' trajectories might change. Now, what you see in this graph is a little sliver of color, which is for the transport sector, and that's growing. As Dr. Liu said earlier, transport sector emissions are not going down, and that is true for many of the countries in the world. So you could go into the sector dashboard and you could look a little bit at the transport sector emissions. We have many different subsectors within transport. What I have here displayed is the emissions from light-duty vehicles, and you could see what that is for the different countries. The color legend, the big one is of course China, and the bottom one is the US. There is some improvement in that we track through different metrics. In order to get the right hand, which has all the colors, on, I guess it's to your left, you have the activity metric. What is the sale of light duty? How much of it is driven? How passenger kilometers are being used by light duty? And then the intensity. So we track activity and intensity in order to know how that sector is decarbonizing. You can see the intensity metric is the GHG emissions, kilograms of CO2 per billion kilometers driven. And you could see what the 2030 and 2020 trend line is. And as Christina showed earlier, they have benchmarks. There are benchmark data which comes from the IEA and many other organizations, which tell us where we need to be. For the transport sector, in order to be compatible to a 2-degree pathway, we should be at 3% fuel economy improvements. The world is at below 2%, so we're not going fast enough. And you can see how many of the countries in the models that we cover are not decarbonizing fast enough on the transport sector. However, Europe is doing better, and so if you have the same kind of stringent fuel economy standards applied more broadly, many other countries could see some of their transport sector emissions going down. And then finally, we have the metrics dashboard, which can be used for the comparison. This is useful because you want to be able to say how your country is doing in certain targets. One example I'm showing here is renewable energy target. And you can't read this, sorry, but if you go to the website, you'll be able to do that. What it shows is the US is lagging behind in renewable energy capacity in 2030 because our investments in the capacity side are not as much as in many of the other regions. Between 2015 to 2030, we're going from 12% to 24%, and many of the other countries in the work that we do are far ahead. So there is some work to be done in helping countries realize where they are, and Adrian will speak a little bit about that as well later. So coming back to the information, so you see the kind of information, there's not enough time here to tell you about it, but just giving you some examples of what you could expect to see at your own leisure if you go to the website. We think the information is just not enough. We need collaborations and partnerships. These are the different people we've been working with over the last 2-3 years that we built this initiative. And the newest partnership is with the International Climate and Society in Brazil and the SEG team, and Tasso will speak a little bit about that shortly. So we're using this collaboration to help pull out unique characteristics in the regions we work in, so that it's useful for the policy experts and for the country experts there to be using ways to link decarbonization with policy indicators. And then why is all of this important? For the action side, we're hoping these partnerships with the countries, not just with us, ClimateWorks in San Francisco, is important because it can help us identify new strategies where we could look at GHG reductions. It's also useful in a lot of our stakeholder engagements we've had in the last 2 or 3 years. We've used that to build, to look at the pace of progress and which sectors or which countries are doing well. And we also want to be able to share with the climate community reliable information that is consistent and that you can expect to see updated on an annual basis. In particular, in terms of our next steps in how we're going to be using this to work with other experts in the countries, we want to be able to look at the INDCs. So Paris was very successful in all of the INDCs. And through the tool, we can actually use that to see how well countries are doing in the stated INDCs. One example here is, all of these countries have very different characterizations of what their INDCs might look like. So we can take some of that and compare it to where we think that country might be in terms of its target. The example we have is for India. India has a very ambitious, aggressive target for renewable energy, 175 gigawatt by 2022. It seems very ambitious compared to what has happened in the last 5-year plans of India. However, because of the learning curve within solar and wind, the price has come down. There's so much of investment going into the market in India, so many projects being created. The policy environment by the government is very conducive that we think India could actually meet its target. On the y-axis is the installed capacity, on the x is the timeline. And we think India can meet its ambitious INDC, not at 2022, but probably a year or 2 later. That's assuming that the investments and the pace and the policy environment is favorable. In some countries, like in the US from last week, we realized that environment can change, and therefore it's really important to be tracking progress on an annual time step. This is one example of how we could track indicators through the INDCs. Another example is through looking at what a country's overall INDC goal is. Some countries don't really tell you what the targets might be within the different subsectors. So we have Mexico. Adrian kindly hosted a workshop for us last year in Mexico City, where we spoke about the carbon transparency, the soft launch of our Mexico model, which was one of the first we developed. And there, through the tool, the model that we have, which you can access through the website as well if you request it, you could look at scenarios to see which sector would contribute most to Mexico's INDC. So if you want to look at it to look at policy-related outcomes, the tool can help you see what the contribution of the different sectors might be. And Adrian can share more information on some of that work. So I'd like to end by telling you some of our plans. I forgot to mention that we didn't, in the dash, when you go to the website, the ClimateWorks tracker, forestry is not there because we're waiting for that to be updated through work we've been doing with the SEG team in Brazil. And once that's up, we'd be putting in both the Brazil model and revised agriculture and forestry data sets, hopefully in the first half of next year. And as I said, what we're looking at is current policies, and therefore anything new that comes in, new policies that come in, or any setbacks, unfortunately, we might have that. We have to be tracking that to see what does that mean in terms of the outcome of greenhouse gas emissions, so that we know how to change course. We don't need to wait till 2025 or 2030 to do so. And lastly, I'd like to end by just telling you ways that we would like to be working with some of you at least who might be interested enough in this work. You could go to the website yourself, and also we want to be citing benchmark data. We want to be looking at what does it mean for a sector to be at 1.5 degrees or well below 2 for the countries. And then if you would like to use the work in your own, some of our work in your own comparisons, that would be great. And you have an opportunity to provide feedback to us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarabi. What an interesting, neat tool for all of us, frankly, to use. Let's drill down a little bit more with our remaining 2 panelists, including on the tracking side. We're going to go to the very end of the table here to Tasso Azevedo, consultant and entrepreneur in the field of forest sustainability and climate change. He coordinates the SEEG network, which we heard just a little bit about, a system to estimate GHG emissions, as well as map biomass, a platform to produce annual land cover and land use maps of entire countries through a multi-institutional collaboration. Tasso was director of the National Forest Program of the Ministry of Environment in Brazil, General Secretary of the National Forest Commission, and one of the key people involved in the design and implementation of the National Plan to Combat Deforestation and the Amazon Fund. Tasso serves on as a board member on several organizations, including the Business Forum on Climate Change and the Rainforest Alliance. So hopefully we are dealing with our technical issues right now.
While we do that, could we have Adrian speak?
All right, while we deal with the technical issues, let's go ahead and flip-flop our two remaining panelists. Adrian, I hope that's okay with you. So let me introduce Adrian. Adrian Fernandez, who I suspect many people in the audience know. Whenever I'm speaking with Adrian at one of these conferences, it's inevitable that multiple people come up to talk, not to me, but to Adrian. So I think Adrian knows just about everybody in these circles. He's former president of the National Ecology Institute and currently heading the Mexico Climate Initiative, a foundation doing some terrifically interesting mitigation and other related work in Mexico. So Adrian, over to you, and then we'll conclude with Tasso after we've got the technical issues resolved. Adrian.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dave. Let me first thank my friends from the International Energy Agency and from ClimateWorks Foundation, my dear cousins, institutionally speaking, for this kind invitation to share with you a few thoughts. Let me start by saying, honestly, that the Carbon Transparency Initiative is one of my favorite initiatives, full stop. In the case of Mexico, we have been privileged of being one of the initial countries working with ClimateWorks in this particular initiative. As Surabhi said, a year ago, October 2015, we were privileged to host, together with ClimateWorks Foundation, a very important workshop in Mexico, where the intent was precisely to call attention to the public, to raise awareness about the need to move faster. This call for urgent action in the very short term. What we don't have is time. We have some resources, we have lots of technologies, but we don't have time. So early action is what we all need. And in view of the NDCs and the time frame for the NDCs, 2030, I was very concerned that many people, many countries could be distracted and might forgotten about the 2020 mitigation goals, and also about this urgency that this panel is being repeating once and again. So the report last year presented in Mexico allowed to show to people that in that particular report, Mexico was together with Russia in not a very nice place, being the only two countries a year ago, using information from the previous sort of 5 years, the only two countries within the G20 with a negative trend in terms of the relative importance of renewable energies in the matrix. The previous years before the report, only Russia and Mexico were reducing the relative importance of renewable energies. This is changing already, but the good news last year is that with the presentation of the report, this made very good headings in the newspapers, and people was talking about that. Government officials were quickly to respond that that was already changing, which is truth. The presentation of the report also came in the best possible timing because it served as an additional empowering tool for local society, for NGO community that had been fighting for the passing of the so-called energy transition law in Mexico, that there was a fierce battle between the iron and steel lobbying against the NGO community, The federal government was supportive of this, but the presentation of the report in October, I believe, was an additional catalyzer so that the public was much more aware about the benefits of renewable energies, and more important, that at that time, solar power, wind power were already competitive against natural gas in spite of the very low prices of gas. So I want to thank our colleagues because for choosing Mexico last year for the event. It was very, very good timing. And the happy final of the story is that as a result of the mobilization of the NGO community, as a result of important campaigns in the media, linking very closely the opportunity of passing an energy transition law with very specific targets for renewable energies to be included within the next decade in Mexico, and linking this with the forthcoming Paris meeting and with direct messages to the president of Mexico. Actually, very strong, very timely campaign saying, Mr. President, Paris is only 7 days away. It's only 5 days away. It's only 3 days away. Don't go to Paris unless the energy transition law is passed. So there was a wake-up call for the presidency. They realized there was an opportunity, not just from the environmental and climate side, but there was also a huge political opportunity for the president. So in the final hours before the start of the heads of state segment in Paris, finally, the two houses of Congress got together, discussed the data, compared the information of Mexico with other countries, showing that other countries were already moving much faster than Mexico, and that in the case of renewable energies, we have huge natural resources, we had competitive prices, and that there was an imminent political opportunity that shouldn't be missed. So finally, we ended up with a happy ending, and the Senate approved the law, and now we have this energy transition law that establishes very ambitious, very clear incremental goals for renewable energies in the matrix, and also very specific goals for energy efficiency. Let me finish by saying that we have a long way to go in almost every other sector. We have to continue working top-down to try to make climate change across all the sectors, but we have very good news from the energy sector, and now we are finally moving, trying to catch up with all the other countries. Thank you again to ClimateWorks and the International Energy Agency for the invitation. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Adrian. And over to you, Tasso, and I won't introduce you again if that's okay, since I just introduced you previously. So
thank you.
Please.
Sorry to be late. I was fighting on an ethanol discussion in another room. The idea is to present this initiative called SEG, which is now working in 3 different countries, each country with this distinguished group of organizations. And now I'll talk about the Brazilian experience within this context, but you have also information about the initiatives also in Peru and India in the global website. So SEG is a system to estimate greenhouse gas emissions in Brazil, which also works on an analysis of policies that drive those emissions. The Climate Observatory is a coalition of 41 NGOs in Brazil and think tankers, part of those organizations are working on this initiative, making all the calculations and the research to produce this 3 main products. One is a free open database on greenhouse gas emissions in Brazil. We also produce some analytical reports annually on the greenhouse gas emission trends, and also about the climate policy implementation and its relationship with those emissions. And lately, we do the science-based climate policy proposals. Like, for example, last year we made a full proposal for the Brazilian INDC, including all the elements that we should be doing in terms of reducing emissions and so on. So this kind of stuff it's the basic work of the Climate Observatory through this project. The free open database of greenhouse gas emissions, it contains emissions from the 1970 all the way to 2015 for all sectors, all gases. We disaggregate this to the level of the national inventory. So if you want to know, I don't know, if you want to know how much the pigs emit on methane in 1973 in one specific state in Brazil, you can get the data, and you can get also the information how we actually calculate that and make this estimation. So it's also disaggregated by the 27 states in the country, and the whole data set it's available to download and to consult in our webpage. So if you go there and seg.global, you can access the 3 countries. This is the open page for Brazil, and you can get all sorts of information about our emissions. You can choose the gas, you can choose the whatever you want, and also you can cross this information with some activity indicators. So you can be the GDP, the population. In this case, we're just crossing the emissions with GDP, but could be a lot of other options like energy production, consumption, and so on. We also produce a lot of materials like this one, like infographics informing how the greenhouse gas emissions history has been in the country. You have this all by state and by sector, so it's pretty much kind of showing the whole story. Why is this important? It's important because Brazil is the 6th largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, just after Indonesia, Russia, India, US, and China. So it does really matter what we do in our policies, right? So this is the trends on our emissions in the last, I'm taking just 99 to 2015. And basically what you see is like 3 different periods. The first period goes all the way to 2005, where the emissions was growing. And then suddenly you have a big decrease on emissions from 2005 to 2010. This is basically due to the decrease of deforestation in the Amazon mainly. And then it's pretty stable. And you see the information also on gross emissions and net emissions, including all the removals from forests. So that's the 2 curves you're seeing there. Now, what's the type of story you can tell when you have all the data on how this is built up and so on? So this is one example. So if you see the emissions dividing by the main sectors, agriculture, energy, energy will be like the red one, and then you have residues, waste, and forestry is land use changes, the green one. What you see is that the decrease of emissions is basically due to the decrease of emissions from deforestation. In fact, this is like 40% decrease in the last 10 years. Now, if you take out the land use change, what you see is a different picture. It's actually the emissions is growing 24%. And it's growing as fast as most of the developing countries, which is the size of Brazil. So it's kind of, when you unpack the things, you start to see where are the problems and the issues that we have to deal with if we want to think on the long run. Another way to see this thing, and then we provide this as a tool, is that you can actually unpack the emissions using the methods of IPCC, and then pack again, consider the economic sectors. And then you see a different picture. You see that 69% of our emissions linked somehow to the agribusiness sector, because there is a lot of land use change, which is directed to agriculture, and you have the waste also related to agriculture and so on. So if you sum up the whole thing, it's actually a story linked to one economic sector that we have to deal with strongly. But you can see also in the story, the story is in 2000 you had like 82% was the agriculture economic sector, and it's now going down to 69. And energy, for example, is growing, transportation is growing, and so on. So you can start to pick where are the opportunities we have to change the trends on the emissions. And last, just to show, there's another way to see the emissions is by state in Brazil. And that's an interesting one, because if you see the two states that have more emissions in Brazil are in the Amazon, which has less people. But that's because of the land use change that we have in the region. And the states that you see here on the your right side are the ones that have lower emission, but these are the states that will have most impact of climate change in Brazil. So it's kind of this, injustice that you have, comparing countries. We can see this inside Brazil, comparing the states. And again, if you take it out land use change, the picture changed a lot. So you see that actually São Paulo, Minas Gerais, which is the more populated industrialized states, are the ones that have more emissions if you take it out the land use change. Now, to finish, I'll just show two examples of how we use this level of disaggregation and understanding of the information and the drivers and the factors that makes the emissions to happen to analyze different policies. So this is a simple one. We made a projection of the drivers of the emissions all the way to 2020 according to the current policies to see if we will be able to achieve our target that we launched in 2009 and what we're seeing is that, yes, we will be very close to the 2020 target because that was based on a projection scenario, business as usual scenario against the current scenario. The other one, it's the effort that we are doing with CTI that's still under revision for publication very soon. But what you see there, it's a scenario for 2030. With the current policy scenario, with gross emissions all the way to 2030. And what we see in this scenario is that we will not, under this scenario, when the current policies, we would not achieve the goal that we actually, the target that we have for Brazil for 2030. So this is the type of exercise that we think it's very important that we know those things and we understand those things as it happens so we can act very fast and change the trajectory as we move year by year.
Thank you very much, Tasso, and all our panelists. Excellent food for fodder as we get into the discussion portion and the questions from the audience portion. As you think about your questions and look to raise your hand, let me just ask one quick question, and I want a lightning round of answers through our panelists. This wasn't prepared ahead of time, so we'll see how quick on our feet all our panelists are. We talked about and learned about a number of very exciting, interesting things going on in the pre-2020 space, different policies, sectors, models. I'd like each panelist to point out one particular sector or policy area, or however they want to define the question, as something they're particularly excited about, something that they think is an area that there's some real mitigation potential that's untapped, that there's an opportunity to scale up, to speed up, going forward. And as each of our panelists is answering that question, I'll be looking through the audience for any other questions from the audience. Let me start with my colleague, Christina, to put her on the hook first. What's one area you're particularly excited about in the pre-2020 space?
It's not a big surprise, but it's energy efficiency. The potential is still there. Countries are starting to seize it, but there's much, much more to be done. In our recent energy efficiency market report, we actually some of my colleagues came to the conclusion that the largest single thing to have reduced emissions over these last few years is actually the energy efficiency program in China, that is the single largest reduction we've seen, and there's much more that can be done.
Terrific. Let's just go right down the line here.
There's lots because China is a very huge country and lots of areas, but I think it's energy transition would be very important, especially how to expand the use of scale use of the renewable energy. I think it's current. Just recently, we have some target for the newly installed capacity target for wind and solar. I think its installed capacity will achieve like 110 gigawatts for solar, wind at least, and also for it's 110 for the solar and 150 for wind by 2020. I think that is new updated target from government. But I think also some problem we need to think about is how to generate power from the wind and solar. So I think we need to think about what we can do in the next 5 years to make sure that wind and solar can be generated in practice.
No, thank you, Dr. Luke. Adrian?
Sure. I have to echo Christina with the energy efficiency sector in general, but let me say a word on vehicle efficiency. Unfortunately, in Mexico, and maybe it is the case of other countries in Latin America, we are lagging behind in the adoption of fuel efficiency standards. It is a pity, it is almost a shame that 10 years ago, we used to have a vehicle fleet both for gasoline and diesel that were more efficient in average than the US fleet. No surprise, it was the years of the large SUVs. It was before the big crisis in which President Obama had to rescue the car industry, but imposing very, very strict fuel efficiency standards. We are not doing that. Unfortunately, this is a typical example of a regulatory capture that needs to be regulated. Is being the sector that normally puts their own standards. So we're lagging behind, and that's a huge opportunity because the only thing we have to do is just to put the right fuel efficiency standards in place. They will continue selling vehicles, but more efficient. So there is a lot of homework to be done still.
So I'd like to parrot my first two panelists and say energy efficiency is definitely the key place, especially for cost-effective decarbonization solutions. And I agree with the transport piece too, huge in every country, except one or two which are leading. But I'd also like to talk about the renewable energy capacity has been growing significantly in many countries, and that's been tremendous. It's hitting close to where you need to be if you look at the IEA's benchmark data. However, the share of capacity being utilized for generation is a different story, and that's where a lot of the investment should go. I've always had big bets on China and how they could decarbonize. I've been very pleased to see how they've been able to meet many of the targets that they have been setting, and I think could be even more ambitious. A lot of the different kinds of advances you need to increase the share of generation has to do with reforming the electricity sector. So that includes grid operation, T&D pricing, market mechanisms. China's plans do have a lot of these coming up since the last year, and how China does will be very important for how a lot of the other countries can also try, all the emerging economies that are seeing capacity increase but not share increasing. And Mexico and the US too could learn from that.
Not to repeat the others, but I will add one obviously is to reduce deforestation. It's very straightforward. We see what's the result when you reduce deforestation. Brazil, although we reduce 80% deforestation in the Amazon, if you sum up all the biomes in Brazil, we still have the largest deforestation rate in the world. So it's kind of we have to push for that. That's one. Another one is the use of biomass in general in energy in Brazil. It's a large space to still grow and fits within the structure that we have today, that we could cut our emissions by 50% in the next 10 years, just if we embed this on the infrastructure that we have now. And last, I would say repair pastures, because this is something that it's a big issue in Brazil. We have 200 million hectares of grasslands dedicated to somehow for cattle production. And if well managed, those lands could be compensate the emissions from the cattle itself. So this is like, and it's something that we know how to do. It's just a question of take the decision and make the investments to do it.
Terrific. Thank you all. We've got a question right there. And please identify yourself before you ask your question. Do we have microphones? There's one coming up here quick, but go ahead and stand up. The microphone's coming to you. Identify yourself as you're asking the question. And then if you direct it, if you want to direct it to anyone on the panel or just the whole panel, please specify as well.
Thanks a lot. Maximilian Kuhn from the Center for Environmental Innovation. I would like to ask you both, Dave and Christina, about what has been mentioned now. Just how do you take into account in the upcoming special report on methane emissions, the reduction potential from crests, wetlands, and all these sites? And are you looking within the special report on the ongoing discussion we heard in the last panel on the global temperature potential, which is better suited to fit the purpose of providing a clearer targets to policymakers?
No, thanks for the question. Why don't we take a couple questions, if there are any? Yes, there's one in the back there. Yeah, right over here. Go ahead, if the microphone's there, go ahead and ask that. We'll capture a few of these questions together. Go ahead, please.
Hi, I'm a student from Emory University, and my question is to Dr. Liu. I'm actually doing research about how various provinces in China can increase their renewable energy mix. And one of the problems that at least we identified is this problem of curtailment. So wind power and solar power that does not get onto the grid. So I want to ask Dr. Liu what policies there are to address this, and how does cost of electricity factor into this? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've got one over here as well. Let's go ahead and take these three questions and then have a round of responses.
Hi, my name is Jujin Kim. I am from an organization named Solutions for Our Climate, which is a nonprofit based in South Korea. I actually asked Dr. Liu a question in the previous session at the Nordic Pavilion about using market-based measures in regulating air pollution in China. Dr. Liu answered that market-based measures such as cap and trade do not work, and unfortunately right now, not unfortunately, but China in reality is using more direct control measures when regulating climate pollution, not air pollution. Having said that, my question leads to, I guess, the panels from the IEA. I would like to ask how essential is a deregulated market is in shifting these externalities into the power market structure, because I believe, and it's just the same thing in Korea. In Korea, why sometimes often market-based measure does not work is because our power market is regulated. And I would like to ask him how your approach on air pollution would need a deregulated market structure. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for the excellent questions and the concise questions. Let's go ahead and see if there are any responses. Dr. Liu, I don't know if you want to start. There was some directed on this side, but certainly other panelists as well should take a turn if they'd like.
Okay, thank you for your questions regarding with renewable energy. Like I mentioned, I think also that Sarabi also mentioned these issues regarding with how to generate renewable energy, but not only the installed capacity. I think that is quite key issues for China now in next 5 years. I think 3 issues we need to pay more attention on that. One is infrastructure construction, especially to build more grids and high capacity grids to link west to east, because most of energy user, high energy user located in the east side of China, but most of producer and resource plenty areas located in West China. So I think that would be one challenge issues and we need to solve first. And second one, I think it's very important is to, the wind power and solar PV, their costs reduced a lot in last 10 years. But I think that Chinese government also provide a lot of subsidy for their development. So I think that in the future, we will continue putting this subsidy, but the most important thing for us to consider is how to use more economy incentive or market mechanism to solve. Because otherwise, as wind power and solar PV become very large scale, it's a very high burden for government to afford. And last one, but I think the most important one is how to solve the intermittency issue of wind power and solar PV. That would be very big issues. So I hope that we can solve that from the energy reformation, energy scheme reformation, but also that from like energy storage technology, because we cannot depend on the hydropower to be as backup power for the wind and solar in China. So we have to think about what kind of battery and other energy storage technology we can use for that. So it's just my personal view, I think, but this is quite actually complicated problem in China, and we need to, I think we already talked this for almost many years, and especially last 2 years, this problem become more serious. So I think we need more experts to work together to solve this problem. Just one issue is regarding with that the Korea colleague mentioned about emission trading. Just want to clarify, I think that the carbon emission trading will become very important market-based instruments in next 5 years for China. and we already built a very good basis from 7 pilots of that. I just mentioned that the emission trading of sulfur dioxide previously not so successful, but I think that is due to the other issues. It's not only due, it's not because of the emission trading itself. So I think I personally believe that the carbon emission trading is still very important in China next 5 years.
Well, thank you, Christina.
Thank you. A couple of questions. So there's a question about how we deal with methane from non-energy sectors. So the IEA's models are really energy models. We try and find, the best views on what are the possible emissions trajectories and others in non-energy sectors and factor those in. So we don't do that ourselves. And then also the discussion about GTPs versus GWPs, or looking at individual gases and not having an aggregation at all. Most of the IEA's modeling work is actually CO2. We tend to focus mostly on the CO2 because of it's really the fundamental issue in the energy sector. I think it's 80% of energy sector emissions is CO2. And it's the one which is tied up with the long-term commitments. So while we do some work on, the short-lived climate forces and the methane and so on, I don't want to get too hung up on the debates and the metrics and the aggregation, because in our own work, we do tend to focus more on the CO2. And in terms of the question around market mechanisms, I kind of have 2 separate answers to that. So one in the context of greenhouse gas emissions trading. I don't think it's so much a question of having to have a particular style of regulation of energy markets. I think it's a case more of needing to design your CO2 market mechanism to match the sort of energy market that you have. So you can do a different design of an ETS to fit with a more regulated energy system. The classic design would be, fully deregulated, all prices passing through. But certainly we at the IEA have done some work thinking about, well, how does this work in more real-world energy systems with real-world regulation? And then a second answer in relation to the air quality and the clean air scenario I showed and how that works. That's not really, it's not using a kind of a cap and trade approach. It's a basket of policies. So there's a lot of energy efficiency in there that reduces demand. There's a big push on renewables that displaces polluting generation. There's a shift from inefficient coal to gas. There's a large push on transport, getting modal shift in transport away from individual vehicles. There's vehicle standards. And then there's end of pipeline controls on plants as well. So there's it's a package of lots of things that need to work together to get you there, rather than a single thing. So.
Go ahead, Tasso.
One in relation to the GTPs, GWPs is always tricky, right? Just to have an idea, Brazil makes all the reports on the GWP on second assessment report, but then the INDC is the GWP from the 5th assessment reports. It's kind of a messy. So what we did was, like, every single data you see in our database is actually on all the 6 metrics. So you have like GTP, GWP, second assessment report, 4th assessment report, 5th assessment. You choose whatever you want in terms of making scenarios. But the point that I want to pick is the one that how we can envision this this process of revision of the ambition, which will happen much sooner than what we would kind of a dream. I think if it happens in 2018, hope this is the point. So what we are trying to do is to prepare ourselves to be able to put on the table as soon as possible the proposals of how can we increase the ambitions on the 3 countries we are working with. In the case of Brazil, we right now know that we can go 20% below the target that Brazil have. So the target that Brazil have will be equivalent to 1.2 gigatons of emission in 2030, against the 1.4 that we have currently in net emissions. And we know that we can go to 1 gigaton in 2030 now with the information that we have right now. And we are working to build up a scenario where in 2050 this will be net zero for Brazil, and this should be and ask that this transform into our national policy. So we pursue this as a country, going to something close to net zero.
No, thank you for that. I've been shown the sign that we're out of time. Before asking for one final round of applause for all our panelists today, let me just offer one concluding thought that ties into the last question that was asked, especially when you focus on near-term action and tracking, as this panel so terrifically dealt with. The challenges, of course, are huge. We've gotten into that, and the scale of challenge is immense. That's a continuing theme, I think, of all of these discussions. But the flip side of that is the opportunities are immense and huge as well. And as a number of colleagues up here today, and I suspect others throughout the halls these next several days are focused on, is we all live in a real world. All our countries have different individual situations that they're in. Different companies have different situations they're in. What we're trying to do, and I think a lot of folks on this panel and elsewhere, trying to figure out what the best data is that's out there. What do we know about the world around us? How can we use sophisticated analytical tools to provide insights into what those opportunities are in a cost-effective way? And how can we work together to implement those real-world ambitious solutions in a timely way? So thank you again for all of our panelists today. Thank you to the audience and those on the web as well. Thank you.